I was sitting in my office, the one with the view of the parking lot I'd earned over 30 years, when my son called to tell me he'd gotten the promotion. "Dad, it happened," Marcus said, his voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. Not quite joy. "Senior Vice President, they announced it today." I remember the exact moment. 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I remember because I just finished signing the vendor contracts for the new construction project, my reading glasses still perched on my head like they always were. I remember the light coming through the window was getting that golden quality it gets in late afternoon, and for a second I couldn't find the right words. "That's congratulations, son," I finally said. "That's wonderful, you must feel amazing." There was a pause, the kind of pause that means something but sounds like nothing. "Yeah, Dad, I do," he said. "I really do." When I hung up, I sat there for maybe 5 minutes just staring at the contract in front of me. Then I called my wife, Susan, and told her the news. She cried a little, happy tears. She'd always believed Marcus would get there. From the time he was a kid, she'd believed he was destined for something big. I believed it too, honestly. That's the thing people don't understand about what happened later. I always believed in him. Let me back up. Not because the beginning matters more than the ending, but because you need to understand what I'd built to understand why the betrayal cut so deep. I grew up poor. Not aesthetically poor like something from a movie where everyone's poignant and wise. Actually poor. My father left when I was 9. My mom worked 2 jobs and still we couldn't make rent half the months. I wore the same pair of shoes until my toes pushed through the bottom. I learned early that if you wanted anything in this life, you had to build it yourself, brick by brick, with your own hands. I got a scholarship to state school, barely. Worked my way through, stayed up until 3 in the morning doing homework after my shift at the warehouse ended at midnight. Got a degree in business management. Started at the bottom of a construction company, moving equipment, taking notes, watching everything. By the time I was 35, I'd built my own firm. By 40, I had 12 employees. By 50, we were doing major commercial projects across 3 states. The money came. The respect came. The house came. A real house, not the cramped apartment I'd grown up in, but a 6-bedroom colonial with a driveway and a lawn that I mowed myself every Saturday, even after I could have hired someone because I wanted to feel the work. I wanted to remember. Marcus was the best part of all that. When he was born, I held him in the hospital and made a promise to him and to myself. He would never know what I'd known. He would never spend a night wondering how the bills would get paid. He would never sleep in a car. He would never feel the shame of not having enough. I was probably that father, the one who tried too hard to give his kid everything he didn't have. But I didn't think I was being foolish about it. I was deliberately building a bridge for him to stand on so he could reach higher than I ever could. When Marcus was in high school, I sat down with him and said, "I'm going to help you get to places I couldn't get to, but you have to do the work. I can open the door, but you have to walk through it." He nodded. He was 16, serious, thoughtful. He said he understood. I paid for his education, not just tuition, but the expensive prep programs, the private tutors for the SATs, the career counselors. I knew people in his field, people who could give him internships and opportunities. I introduced him to them, made the phone calls, called in favors I'd built up over 30 years of honest work. Not to hand him anything, but to give him a real shot. And he worked. In the beginning, he actually worked. In college, he'd email me updates about his projects, his grades, his ambitions. He wanted to go into corporate finance. He was sharp, naturally sharp in a way that even my pride couldn't exaggerate. The kid had a gift for reading numbers, understanding markets, seeing the angles. After graduation, I helped him get interviews at 3 major firms. He landed at Whitmore and Associates, a mid-size investment firm where I knew the CFO. It wasn't because of me, though. That's what I tell myself. It was because he interviewed well, because he was smart. He started there at 23, entry-level analyst position. I didn't help him after that. Or I tried not to. I'd meet him for lunch sometimes and he'd talk about his work, and yeah, maybe I'd mention something to my contacts here and there, but I was trying to let him build his own way. For the first 3 years he did. I noticed the change slowly. I didn't see it all at once because I wasn't looking for it. Why would I be looking for my own son to be lying to me? The first thing was the car. He showed up at my office one day driving a new Tesla, not new in the 5-year-old used sense. New, $85,000 new. How'd you swing that? I asked, walking around it, running my hand along the hood like an idiot. Got a bonus, he said. He was smiling, but there was something in his eyes that looked rehearsed. Big client investment paid off. They recognized my work. I didn't have a reason not to believe him. Why would he lie about a car? I congratulated him, told him to be careful with it, made a mental note that his firm was apparently paying their analysts bonuses I wasn't aware were being handed out to 26-year-olds. Then it was the apartment. He'd been living in a modest place in the city, nothing fancy, which I actually respected. One day he told me he was moving to a high-rise in the financial district. Really want to be closer to the office, he said. I asked him how much it was. $3,000 a month, he said. But I can afford it now, Dad. You don't have to worry. $3,000 a month. On an analyst's salary, even with bonuses, the math didn't quite work. But I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be one of those fathers who counts his kids' money and judges how he spends it. I wanted him to feel free. I wanted him to know I trusted him. These small things accumulated. The way he'd changed the subject when I asked about specific projects at work. The vague answers about his responsibilities. The dropped comments about senior people I'm working with and big deals in motion that never quite resolved into real information. My wife noticed it before I did. She mentioned it one night, lying in bed, reading a book while I was scrolling through my phone. There's something off about Marcus lately, she said, without looking up from her page. What do you mean? I asked, already on the defensive without knowing why. I don't know exactly, just the way he talks about work, it sounds rehearsed. Like he's practicing something instead of just talking about his day. I didn't want to hear that. I told her she was being paranoid, that he was just excited about his career, that success was changing him. She didn't push it. She rarely does with me. She knows I don't like being questioned about my son. But she'd planted something, a small seed of doubt that I couldn't quite kill. The real beginning of the end came when my CFO, Richard, called me. Richard and I go back 15 years. We've been through contract negotiations, market crashes, and the birth of each other's children. We talk strategy, finances, industry gossip. We're friends, or at least as close to friends as two men in business can be. Hey, I have a weird question, he said. We were grabbing lunch at a place we go to occasionally, the kind of place where we can talk freely. Shoot, I said. Is Marcus looking to move firms? Has he talked to you about that? My stomach did something small and sharp. No, why? Richard set down his sandwich. I got a call from David Chen over at Whitmore. He was asking me about my compensation structure for senior analysts, asking specifically about bonuses, incentive structures, whether I'd ever given someone a significant payout to make a position seem higher level than it was. I stared at him. What the hell does that mean? It means, Richard said slowly, that David was asking me in a very roundabout way to verify some claims Marcus apparently made about his position and compensation. There was some issue with a client. They were looking at Marcus as a potential hire, and when they started fact-checking his background, some numbers didn't add up. I put my fork down. My hands felt cold. David didn't want to throw Marcus under the bus, Richard continued, but he wanted to know if I thought Marcus was a bullshitter or if maybe you, his father, were inflating his position for some reason. Why would I do that? I heard my voice sound strange, distant. Because that's what fathers do sometimes, Richard said gently. Especially fathers who built themselves from nothing. They have their kids on their shoulders so high the kids start believing they're taller than they actually are. I left lunch early. I didn't eat anything after that. I went back to my office and closed the door and sat in the dark. I didn't even turn on the lights and just breathed for a while. When I could move again, I did something I hadn't done since he was in high school. I called Whitmore and Associates and asked to speak to David Chen, the CFO. I told his secretary it was personal, that I was Marcus's father. David took the call, and I heard it in his voice immediately. Discomfort mixed with something like sympathy. How much of what he told us is real? I asked without preamble. There was a long pause. Then David said, "He's a good analyst, David. He really is. He's got talent. But if you're asking me whether his job title, his compensation, and his responsibilities are what he's been telling people, then no. No, not really." "Tell me exactly what his position is." David told me. It was almost entry level. 3 years in and he was still basically where he'd started. The bonuses he'd mentioned, if he got them at all, would be standard cost of living adjustments. The big deals he talked about, he was maybe the 10th person in the room on those. The Tesla, the apartment, the expensive lunches, none of it made sense on his actual income. "Where's the money coming from?" I asked. "I don't know," David said. "That's actually part of why I was asking around. There's a discrepancy in our records. Last year, we had someone access client account information in a way that wasn't exactly flagged. The access came from inside the network, but the trades that happened afterward benefited someone externally. We're still investigating, but..." He didn't have to finish. I understood. I sat there in that dark office, and I understood exactly what my son had done. I didn't confront him immediately. I needed to know everything first. It took me 4 days of making calls, pulling strings, and using the fact that I still had some respect in certain circles to get the full picture. The lawyers, the compliance officers, the whispered conversations with people who worked in fraud investigation. Marcus had been stealing from Whitmore's clients. Not a lot of money per trade, but small amounts that he'd layered through multiple transactions and moved to an external account. He'd been doing it for about 2 years. The total, and this is where I felt something in my chest physically snap, was around $430,000. My son, my smart, talented son who I'd given everything to, he'd committed fraud. Not because he had to, not because we were poor, because he couldn't be patient, because he wanted to seem successful faster than he could actually become successful, because the bridge I'd built for him wasn't high enough or fast enough, so he decided to steal. When I finally called him and asked him to meet me at my office, I almost couldn't go through with it. I almost called Susan and told her everything. I almost turned back. But I didn't. I wanted to see his face. I needed to know if he'd even have the decency to feel shame. He came in at 6 in the evening, when the office was empty. He was wearing an expensive suit that I now understood he'd bought with stolen money. He looked confused about why I wanted to meet with him alone. "Marcus, I need you to tell me the truth," I said. "I need you to sit down and tell me exactly what's been happening at Whitmore for the last 2 years. I watched the blood drain from his face. I watched him calculate options. I watched him try to think of a lie, and I watched him realize there was no lie left to tell. "Dad." "Don't," I said. "Just tell me what you did." He told me. He told me how he felt like he wasn't progressing fast enough, how the real money was in the markets, but you had to be senior to access those trades. He told me how he'd figured out the system, how it would have been impossible to catch if his greed hadn't made him sloppy. He told me he was planning to stop, that he'd already stopped, that the last trade was 3 months ago, and he was going to cover it slowly with legitimate savings. He told me, in other words, all the things a person says when they're caught red-handed. What he didn't do was apologize, not really, not in the way that matters. He said, "I'm sorry," but what he meant was, "I'm sorry I got caught." He said I made a mistake, but what he meant was I took a risk and it didn't work out. He didn't say I betrayed your trust or I threw away everything you built for me, because I don't think he understood that's what he'd done. At the end of the conversation, after he'd confessed everything, he looked at me with something like hope in his eyes and said, "You can fix this, right? You know people. You can figure out how to make this go away." That's when something shifted in me, something cold and clear. "No," I said, "I can't, and I'm not going to." I called David Chen back the next morning and told him that Marcus had confirmed the allegations. I told him I was prepared to provide documentation and witness statements. I didn't ask for leniency. I didn't ask for anything except that the process move forward according to law. Marcus was arrested 3 weeks later. By that time, he'd lawyered up. I paid for the lawyer initially, but I told him the moment the trial started, I was done. He asked me why I was doing this, why I wasn't protecting him, why I was letting him go to prison. I told him the truth, because he'd made the choice to steal, because every consequence he faced now was a consequence he'd earned, because if I stepped in and fixed this, I would be teaching him that there were no consequences, that his father's money and connections were a safety net he could throw himself into as many times as he wanted. "But I'm your son," he said. I remember his voice on the phone, thin and desperate. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm not saving you." He got 3.5 years. Not as long as he deserved, probably. The lawyer was good. Whitmore decided to pursue it as an internal disciplinary matter for the most part, though they did press charges for the most egregious transactions. I went to the sentencing. Susan didn't come, she couldn't. She cried for days, caught between her son and what he'd done, unable to fully fault either of us. I sat in the courtroom and watched my son be led away, and I felt something like relief mixed with a deep, irreconcilable grief. What I didn't expect was the aftermath. Not the part everyone knows about, the trial, the conviction, the prison term. I mean the part that came after, the part that keeps unfolding even now. About 6 months into his sentence, I got a letter from a woman I'd never heard of. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she was a prosecutor working on a separate fraud case. She was investigating a Ponzi scheme run by a man named Robert Mercer, and in the course of that investigation, her team had found communications between Mercer and Marcus. Mercer had been feeding Marcus tips. Mercer, it turned out, had connections at Whitmore through another employee, and he'd been essentially running a scheme where he'd identify vulnerable clients, then feed information to Marcus about which accounts to target. Marcus hadn't been acting alone. He'd been complicit in something bigger, something more deliberate than I'd understood. When I read that letter, I couldn't quite process it. I had to read it 3 times. And then I had to sit down and think about all the conversations I'd had with my son where he'd talked about senior people and being brought in on things and being trusted with bigger plays. He hadn't been lying about those things. He'd been complicit. He'd been working with someone who was actively defrauding people, and he'd been doing it for money. I called David Chen and asked him to find out exactly how many of Whitmore's clients had been affected. The number was 47. They'd lost money. Not huge amounts. Mercer's operation was sophisticated enough to hide the theft, but together it was in the millions. I started making phone calls. I contacted a lawyer independently and had him help me identify all the affected clients. I sent each of them a letter explaining what had happened, along with a personal donation from me. Not to make it right. You can't make that right. But because I could afford it and they couldn't. It took me 18 months to contact all of them. During that time, I was getting my business in order. I was starting to think about what comes next. Here's the thing nobody tells you about raising a child. You spend years building them into a person, and then you find out that the person you built isn't who you thought they were. And the part that breaks you isn't just that they did something wrong. It's that they did it deliberately. They lied to your face. They looked at everything you'd given them and decided it wasn't enough, so they stole from people who had less. I had to reckon with the fact that I hadn't made Marcus who he was. He'd made himself who he was. All I'd done was give him the freedom and the resources to make his choices. I'd given him the platform to become a thief. For a long time, I was angry about that. Furious, actually. I'd think about it in the middle of the night, and the rage would wake me up like a physical thing. But eventually, the anger got boring. It just became a fact I had to carry. I stopped visiting Marcus in prison after the first year. He asked Susan why, and she told me. She called me after that conversation, and we both just sat with it. I don't think I can explain to him why I don't visit. How do I tell my son that I love him but I also don't recognize him? That the boy I raised and the man he's become seem like different people, and the man he's become is not someone I want to spend time with. So I just don't go. The twist, the part that made me understand the whole thing differently, came about 4 years after his arrest. By then, his case had mostly faded from view. He still had another year or so of his sentence left. I'd mostly moved on, though the shame of having a son in prison doesn't ever fully leave you. It just becomes part of how you're known. I was having lunch with Richard again. We still did that occasionally, and he mentioned something that struck me wrong. "You ever think about what made him do it?" Richard asked. "All the time," I said, "and I know why he did it. Impatience, greed, ambition outpacing his ability to wait for it." "Yeah," Richard said, "but did you ever think about why he thought he needed to do it?" I didn't understand the question at first. Richard leaned back. "When Marcus was first working at Whitmore, David told me he was really struggling with self-doubt, with feeling like he wasn't good enough, with the idea that no matter what he did, he'd never actually be successful on his own terms. He'd always just be the boss's kid." I felt something cold move through my chest. According to David, Marcus told him that his father, you, had built an entire empire, and he felt like he'd never be able to measure up to that. So he was trying to shortcut his way to success so he could prove he'd actually earned something. I sat there with my sandwich getting cold, and I realized something that I should have understood years earlier. Marcus had been drowning in my shadow, not standing on my shoulders. I'd built this bridge for him thinking it was a gift, but what if he'd experienced it as a burden? What if instead of feeling lifted up, he'd felt like he was being measured against an impossible standard? Every connection I made for him, every opportunity I handed him, every time I'd told him I believed in him, what if that had just made him feel like he wasn't ever going to be enough? I'm not saying that justified what he did. I'm saying that for the first time, I understood it in a way that wasn't just about his failure. It was about mine too. A couple weeks after that conversation with Richard, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I called Marcus. For the first time in 3 years, I called my son in prison. "Hi, Dad," he said. His voice sounded older. "Prison does that to you, I guess, or maybe it's just that you age differently when you're somewhere like that." "I need to tell you something," I said. "And I need you to listen, and I need you to know that I'm not doing this because I'm forgiving you. I'm not. What you did was inexcusable." "Okay," he said quietly. "But I did something too. I spent your entire life trying to build you into something bigger than myself, and I think maybe I put so much weight on your shoulders that you collapsed under it." There was silence on the line. "That doesn't excuse your choices," I continued. "But I want you to know that I've been thinking about my part in this, and I've been thinking about the fact that I went to David Chen and made sure your prosecution went forward and that nothing was swept under the rug. I did that partly because you deserved it, but I think I also did it because I wanted to punish you for not being the son I'd imagined you'd be." "Dad, let me finish. I want to give you something. When you get out, you're going to need help. Not money. I don't think giving you money is what you need, but I'm going to help you find work. Not at one of the places I have connections, but at a place where you start clean, where you build something because you actually built it. And I want you to understand that your success isn't my success. It's not a reflection on me. It's just yours. You're allowed to fail. You're allowed to be less than I was. You're allowed to be exactly who you are, without needing to prove anything. I don't know if he understood what I was saying. I'm not even sure I understand it fully. But I said it, and it was the truest thing I'd said to him in maybe 15 years. He got out last year. I helped him find a job at a small firm, nothing fancy, entry-level work. He wasn't happy about it, but he took it. He's living in an apartment that costs less than what I pay for a single suit. He goes to therapy. I made that a condition of me staying involved at all. We have lunch sometimes now, and it's strange and uncomfortable, and we don't talk about what happened. We talk about the work he's doing, about what he's reading, about small things. There's a formality to it that there wasn't before, and I don't know if that ever goes away. Sometimes I catch him looking at me with an expression I can't quite read. I think it's gratitude, maybe, or possibly resentment. Maybe both, I don't ask. What I know is that I stopped trying to be the hero of his story. That's not my job anymore. My job now is just to be his father, which it turns out is a lot harder than just being the guy who opens doors. I'm 61 now. I'm not going to build another empire. I'm thinking about selling the business and retiring early. Susan and I talk about traveling, seeing places, doing things that aren't about work or building or proving anything. The thing I didn't expect, when everything fell apart with Marcus, was that I'd have to face the fact that I'd built my entire identity around what I'd accomplished. And once that was stripped away, once I had to actually reckon with the person beneath all the success, I realized I didn't really know who I was. So I'm figuring that out now, slowly, without an agenda, without trying to be anything for anyone except myself. That's probably the real consequence of what happened. Not the money I spent helping his victims, not the years I didn't see my son. It's the fact that I had to finally stop running and just be a person. And I'm still not sure if that's something I'm good at. But I'm learning.